and welcome to the Engineering Influence podcast from the American Council of Engineering Companies. My name is Diana Alexander, and I am the Director of Private Market Resources with ACEC. Today, we're coming to you live from ACEC Annual Fall Convention of 2022, sponsored by HDR. We're in beautiful Broadmoor Hotel in Colorado Springs, and I am joined by Josh Brooks, Principal and Denver Office Director for Sasaki. Sasaki is an interdisciplinary architecture, planning, landscape, and design firm with offices in Boston, Denver, New York, and Shanghai. Josh's interest is in the intersection of people and infrastructure, and where he focuses on the planning, design, and implementation of urban places. Joshua, welcome, and thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So the reason we're talking with Josh today is because we just wrapped up our private markets panel focused on how airports transform communities into development districts. On the panel, we were also joined by Ken Schwartz, the Senior Vice President and Planning and Design Service Leader from VHB, an engineering design firm, and Elise Brennigmeyer, the Director of Real Estate Projects with Den Real Estate, a division of Denver International Airport. So I'm going to ask Josh some questions, let him get some response time, and we'll wrap it up. So Josh, why don't we start with the basics? For the listeners that maybe aren't familiar with Denver's airport city, can you please share the evolution of the relationship of airports to cities?
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating one and goes back to really the creation of airports as a piece of our infrastructural system. When we think about, the 1920s and 30s, when the airport sort of land use first became a thing, a lot of these places were built close to the things that they served. We didn't have mass transportation connecting large tracts of land far out on the hinterlands. Rather, we built these places, and some of them were evolved from former military bases and things like that. So the location of these places happened organically. And I think the relationship of cities to airports has been a constantly changing one, and one that has an interesting past, both in terms of the movement of airports from former locations to their current locations, but also the way that cities have evolved around some of these places. And in the session, we talked a lot about different models of what I would call aerotropolis, which are, really the ecosystem that revolves around airports. And that by that, I mean advanced manufacturing, distribution, hospitality, retail, and even residential uses that want to co-locate next to these places because of the access and convenience that they afford. Over time, cities have, had tenuous relationships with some of these places, but also, sort of coexistent ones. And what's fascinating is some of these places, which were located, for a very good reason close to cities, actually were pushed out. Stapleton, former Stapleton Airport is a perfect example of that, and one that, was located in a certain place. And then as the city grew up around it and more residential came, the city of Denver made a very conscious decision to actually export that airport to a completely different location and decommission the entire site, and the aviation uses ceases to exist.
Right. So then we kind of searched out in our session about how there's not only economic development that's created on the, airport site of Den, but because of the old airport moving, there were then developments made there. I think you guys said there was a residential development and other opportunities elsewhere. Can you tell us more about those locations and where this has happened too?
Yeah, I mean, this is a fascinating thing that's happening really around the country and around the world, and projects that we're involved in span from Athens, Greece to Picton, Ontario to Denver, Colorado. And, it's not only commercial airports, but also, former military bases. There are, plenty of examples, and whether that's Dallas's Hensley Field or Lowry Air Force Base in Denver, former airfields, which are, huge tracts of land within urban settings. And when the aviation use ceases to exist, there's a really great opportunity to transform those into new places. These are really exciting, and you can look at, Stapleton and now Central Park neighborhood of Denver as a perfect example, some 25 years later, and what it has become. What was, thousands of acres of airport runways and aviation uses and hangars and terminals and everything is is now a thriving single family, fairly dense residential neighborhood. One of the ones that has, the best park systems running through it, one of the ones that has the most modern infrastructure running through it, because these places are able to be built wholesale from scratch. I mean, literally tearing down, essentially all of the infrastructure that was supporting aviation and replacing it with a brand new infrastructure is fascinating. Some other examples of that, which I think are really amazing, is when, these sites kind of become creatively reused. We're currently working on the former Athens, Greece Metropolitan Airport, which was decommissioned to host the Olympics when the Olympics were in Athens, Greece, and the airport was actually moved to the entire other side of the peninsula. But what was left in its place is 1,200 acres of land that had, huge runways, an old Aerosarin building, lots of old hangars. And we're actually working on what will be the largest commercial redevelopment in Europe's in Europe right now, which is millions and millions of square feet of new development and a 600-acre central park, largest urban park that will ever be built in Europe, on the scale of Central Park in New York, Hyde Park in London. Part of that strategy is actually reusing some of that. So we're harvesting material from the runway, these huge, concrete slabs that have marble aggregate in them, and using them in site furnitures, and, creating really novel ecosystems where there once was heavy industrial and industrial land. So it's quite fascinating.
Right. So I'm really glad you brought up the land use that's not focused on aeronautical development, because there is so much surrounding land around these airports that can be used for other types of development. We heard today about warehouses, retail, biomed, even research and development. So I wanted to really call that out for our listening engineers, because it's not just about aeronautical work. Because of airports and their development, there are so many opportunities for all different kinds of work surrounding them. They talked about stormwater, wastewater, transportation. You need roads. There's just so much opportunity for work, and it is a trend worth watching in your area to see where airports are going next. I also wanted to talk about something really interesting, because it came up in our opening general session with our keynote speaker, and it was about this idea of mobility and how air taxis are coming. So is there anything you can tell us about that? And is there already a plan for it at DEN, or are you seeing it on any of your other projects?
Yeah, I mean, this is a technology that has been underdeveloped for, many, many years, and companies like Uber and Lyft and others are creating, vertical takeoff aircraft and short takeoff aircraft. ETOL, VTOL is the acronyms that get thrown around. And again, this is not necessarily new technology. Helicopters, for example, in Brazil were used to bring people around, or still used to bring people around in a much higher, per capita basis than they are in the United States of America. I think the reality is that it's a huge perceptional thing that us as a society has to get used to. Are we ready for, aircraft to be flying around our city and dropping people off? But, there are really amazing opportunities in places like Los Angeles or San Francisco that don't have huge transportation systems, mobility systems built out other than roads, where these can sort of jump the gap in terms of technology. Like many African countries, cell phones are more prevalent than landlines and have been for forever. And this is an opportunity to actually jump the gap in terms of technology, to create mobility systems where they haven't been built out. I don't think DEN was necessarily thinking about that when we crafted the master plan. Because that was a few years ago, and really this technology is kind of quickly being evolved by groups like Uber and Lyft that are looking to bring it to market fairly soon. But I do think a lot of places are starting to think about vertiports and how those get integrated into cities. And the other thing I would bring up is that, airport influence development is not just, on airport property per se. Places like the Seaport in Boston, which are just across the harbor from Boston Logan, that is an aerotropolis in every sense of the word. And really a lot of that development is, on sort of this international economy that uses Logan and Boston as a hub, and that is directly influenced by its location and proximity. And those are the types of places where some of this new technology is likely to come to market before it probably enters, places like Den or Logan or other, municipal airports.
Right. Very interesting. I also, I noted something when looking through the master plan that you guys have online. And I thought this was so interesting because the term used to be location, location, location. And now you guys have it coined as accessibility, accessibility, accessibility. And that's the idea of this Aerotropolis. So if you could summarize for our listeners that maybe weren't there, you had mentioned kind of these 4 key nodes in the area. What's going on in each of them? What's the focus? Is there any opportunity for future development there?
Yeah, I mean, I think the goal of the master plan was to set a framework for the market to tell DIN what they thought. And so it's not necessarily going in and saying there's going to be a hospitality component or hotel component here. It's going to, a gas station is going to go here, or some retail is going to go here, or some corporate campus is going to go here. But the reality is given the sort of scale of the land that, exists there, the goal was to set up the sort of infrastructure and decision-making matrix that then could evaluate these types of things. And so, for example, out on 72nd and Himalaya, there's huge land out there, some 200 acres that could be used for advanced manufacturing, distribution, warehousing, sort of logistics and technology that want to be directly located next to an airport. But can't find a place or can't find, land big enough that's not on airport land, to locate there. And because that's so far away from the runway protection zone and other technical constraints, you could actually see smokestacks or other things that need height and bulk and things like that. Whereas, something like the east approach, which is again directly south of the terminal and the new Westin Hotel, might actually be much more suited for conferencing and office and hospitality components that would support, people flying in, going to a conference, and then flying out the next day. And so each one of the nodes from a market standpoint has probably a unique position, but the goal of the master plan was to really set up that framework that I think protects a lot of those sort of natural resources that DIN has as an asset. I mean, 34,000 acres of prairie grassland, essentially in a contiguous fashion is not something that gets found every day. And so I really give DIN a lot of credit in making that a sort of focus of the plan, is that protecting their natural resources was as important as sort of setting up those development nodes.
Absolutely. So that is about all the time we have for today. And lastly, thank you, Josh, again, for joining us in Colorado today and for participating in our private markets panel.
Of course, it was a lot of fun.
Great. And thank you, listeners, for joining us on another Engineering Influence podcast from ACEC. Have a good one.